So while John is setting up the microphone, let me first introduce myself and him. So I'm Luis Zingales, and I'm the director of the Stigler Center, who is sponsoring this short course. John Matsusaka is actually a PhD from Chicago in 1991, and currently visiting the Stigler Center, but his real job is at the University of Southern California, where he is the Charles Sexton Professor of American Enterprise, if I got it right. But also, what characterizes John is that he's not only a business school professor looking at corporate governance, he is also interested in governance, political governance, and he actually has a courtesy appointment at the law school and the political science department, which makes him one of the few business school professors to be actually broad. In addition to that, he is a director of a national and referendum institute that study, not surprisingly, direct democracy and referendum. And given that he was here for this quarter, I decided that we all want to understand more how direct democracy works or doesn't work, and whether this is the solution to some of the demands that we see out there. So, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luigi. And thanks to all of you for coming here. It's really great for me, having been a student here, and having so many connections with the university over the years, to be able to present this stuff here. As Luigi said, I was a PhD student in economics a long time ago. I spent a sabbatical at the Stigler Center about 15 years ago. I'm spending another sabbatical here at the Stigler Center this year. My daughter is not in school, but she's an undergraduate here as well. So I have a lot of connections to the university, a lot of affection for the university, but beyond all that, this is just a great place for talking about ideas. So what I want to talk about today and the next couple of days are ideas that I've been pulling together, thinking through, which will end up as a book. And this is the first chance I've had to really air them in public, and so I can't think of a better place to do it than here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the ideas, and I think I should leave time at the end, right? So I'll leave some time at the end for your questions, if you have questions, and comments and so forth. So let me just get right into it. This is going to be fundamentally about direct democracy, but I'm going to talk a fair amount about populism today as well. But the natural place to start is just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, what exactly is direct democracy. And maybe the best way to understand direct democracy is to define what it's not. It's not representative democracy. So representative democracy is what we usually think of. We elect somebody to make the laws for us. It's not that. And in fact, direct democracy is really citizens voting directly or deciding directly on laws. So there's a really old form of this that sometimes people have heard of, people who like history. This goes way back to the ancient Greeks in Athens, where they used to have all the citizens, or actually all the male citizens, would get together in a room and they would decide whether they're going to declare war on somebody or not. And again, they didn't appoint somebody to make those decisions for them. It's like everybody was eligible. Everybody shows up and makes that decision together. There's some vestiges of that still around in the world in the form of town meetings and so forth. But it's really not it's not a really viable way to think about running government in any sort of state or city of any scale. So the more practical thing that we're going to be talking about here is this idea of citizens going in and voting directly on laws. And let me just give you an example just to make this concrete. Brexit is one example that's in your mind. Let me give you another one. This was just from November 2016. I just pulled this right off of the ballot in California. There was a question, Proposition 64. The title was called Marijuana Legalization Initiative Statute. The question was very simply, do you want to make marijuana legal for recreational use in the state of California? Check yes or check no. The majority of voters checked yes, and therefore it became law under California law. It became legal to sell and to possess and consume marijuana for recreational use. So that's the basic idea that we're talking about. Now, I just need to define a little bit of terminology, and that's kind of boring perhaps, but there's different types of direct democracy, and I'm going to be referring to them, so I need to at least tell you what the different types are, because they're somewhat different, and so I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. But the main division in when people talk about direct democracy has to do with how the law originates. And so there's essentially two ways you can think about it. You can think about voting on laws that are proposed by the government, or you can think about voting on laws that are proposed by citizens themselves. And here's kind of the names. I'm going to put some names up here, so just have patience with me. One type of, so these guys, laws proposed by government, I'm going to call those referendums. Those are usually called referendums. I know it's going to bother you, so this is a bit pedantic, but I know it's going to bother you. There's this question about referendums versus referenda. And I know it's funny because I've done this and I've been funny some of you. Most people nowadays use referendums, and the reason is that referendum is not a Latin word. It's a word that was sort of stolen, and it kind of looks like Latin. It doesn't have a natural plural. There's no, anyway, Oxford English Dictionary has a nice discussion if you want to know that, and they recommend referendums. So I'm only saying that because I have a feeling this is plugging some of it. So I say referendum. Okay. All right, so referendums are going to be things that you vote on for that the government proposed. Probably the most famous recent example is Brexit, and the first type is advisory referendums. The government doesn't have to follow the decision. So Brexit is like that. Another very important recent one from 2016 as well was a referendum in Colombia, where the government negotiated a peace treaty with the FARC rebels, which they've been fighting within the country for decades. They negotiated a peace treaty. They put it to the voters. They said, do you guys want to accept this peace treaty or not? The voters actually said no in that case. Another example was Greece in 2015, when the government put a vote on the ballot said, do you want to accept the bailout terms from the IMF and ECB and so forth? And the voters in that case said no as well. But these are all advisory measures put on the ballot by the government, so that's one type. Another very important type is what we'll call a mandatory referendum. And this is something that it originates from the government, but the government is bound by it and has to put it on the ballot. The most common examples of these are mandatory referendums on debt and taxes. You'll see these quite often in local governments. I'm not quite sure, but I think in a number of, in the state of Illinois, I think a number of school districts, for example, have to, if they want to borrow money, say for capital construction, I believe they're required to put that on the ballot for approval by the voters. And that's a very common thing. About 30 states actually have requirements that anytime the state wants to issue bonds, it has to go to the voters for approval. It's also common to have these mandatory referendums on things like tax increases. Right now in California, any local government that wants to increase any tax must put it to the voters before they can do it. So there's a variety of things. Switzerland has the Swiss cantons, which are states. They have, most of them have a rule that says any new government spending program has to be approved by the voters. Okay, so there's a bunch of different forms of this. The most common that happens, so much that people don't even think it's direct democracy, I think, is that every state in the country except for one requires that constitutional amendments, that is amendments to the state constitution, go to the voters for approval. So that's so normal that I think people will be surprised if it were not the case. One state doesn't do that actually. But that again is a form of direct democracy. There's a third kind of referendum, which is not used very much, so I'm not going to end up saying very much about it, but it's a petition referendum. And what that is that the voters have the option to challenge some action of the government by collecting signatures. And so a recent example, another one from California, is that the legislature passed and the governor signed a law to ban the use of plastic bags at grocery stores and to require grocers to charge 10 cents in California because it's more expensive than out here. You have something very similar here in Chicago. So they passed that law. Some citizen groups didn't like that, or maybe their industry groups, but some groups didn't like that, so they collected signatures to challenge that. And there's a certain number of signatures, and they put it on the ballot, and it went to the vote of the electorate in November 2016. They asked the voters to approve that law, actually. Okay, so those are the three types of referendums. And again, they're all about laws that are passed, originate with the government. The other type of direct democracy, which is really the highest octane part, is what's called the initiative. And these are laws that are proposed by the citizens. And that marijuana measure is one example. It's not that the government was thinking about would it be a good idea to do this or not. The government wanted to have nothing to do with this. But some citizens wanted to, and they gave it a try, and this particular thing worked. So the way initiatives work is that any citizen gets an idea. They can collect signatures. If they get enough signatures, it goes on a ballot. And then the majority will. And we'll be talking a lot about this because this is the one that gets the most attention and can have the most far-reaching effect. But it really breaks the agenda control that like you just have over what gets discussed. Okay. let me tell you a few, again, I want to talk mostly about populism because I want to set up why we might be thinking about direct democracy in the first place today. But let me give you a little bit more background on direct democracy, and I want to dispel some misconceptions. One of the misconceptions about direct democracy is that it's something new and something kind of exotic. And what people kind of think, well, we know what's going on in California, but this is the sort of innovative new thing. And I think that's the wrong impression, and I want to sort of try to clear that away. And to try to give you an example of this, let me give you some facts, and I'll put up some pictures. So direct democracy in the United States goes way back to the very beginning. In fact, literally the very beginning. When the states were voting to adopt the U.S. Constitution, that is to create the United States, one of the states actually decided to just put it to a vote of the people. Okay, so it's really just Rhode Island. So from the very start of the republic, somebody was already using direct democracy. States in about the early 1800s started to put constitutional amendments to the voters, so that by the mid or late 19th century, pretty much everybody did that routinely. In around the 1840s or so, states started to require debt issues to go to the voters. And that came after some scandals and controversies. States were essentially borrowing money and using people to start banks or to do public works projects like canals and so forth. And they were absconding with the money and leaving the taxpayers on the hook for things. And so eventually they put these things in the 1840s. But again, by the late 1800s, a lot of states have had this. So many of these forms have been around for quite some time. The newest one is the initiative, and that's again the most high-powered one. And that didn't start coming around until the 1890s or so, and that's one that gets all the attention. Let me show you what it looks like. Here's a map of the United States, and in yellow are the states that currently allow initiatives. Remember, these are citizens can actually propose new laws, new constitutional amendments, what have you. And what I put in there in parentheses were the years that the states adopted the initiative process. So the first state to adopt was South Dakota, 1898. And you can see that by the end of the First World War, about 20 states had adopted. Right now, it's essentially half the states, 24, that had adopted the initiative process. There's a couple things to note about that. First of all, even the most newest form of direct democracy, which is the initiative process, is really old. It's 120 some odd years old. And just to put that in context, it's older than universal women's suffrage. It's older than direct election of U.S. senators. It's older than Social Security, federal income tax. None of these things we think of sort of particularly modern, new things. It's been around a long, long time, and it's all over the country. So again, people sometimes want to think of this as being something exotic that's festering in the corners of the country, but I think it's much better thought as something that's actually been part of governance at the subnational level for a long time in this country. It's an integral part of democracy. Moreover, it's not just in one place. It's certainly most popular in the West. You can see most of the Western states allow initiatives, but it's really all over the country. It's in the South, Florida, Mississippi, Arkansas. It's in the Northeast. It's in the Central regions. It's all over the country. So it's not just California, as sometimes people think. That's at the state level. If you go down into the local level, it's even more extreme. These data are actually tricky to collect, but I had some law RAs one year go through and read through hundreds, if not thousands, of city charters. So we can actually count up what percentage of cities actually allow initiatives. And those are the numbers. So in the West, we calculate 97% of cities allow initiatives, essentially almost all of them. And you can see the numbers are extremely high in all regions. Even the lowest region, which would be the central region, is 59%. It's the majority of local governments allow initiatives. So again, the picture I'm trying to suggest here is that these are very common processes with these countries. And they also go way back. The earliest cities to adopt were in about the 1890s. Okay, so that's kind of a very brief overview of what this stuff looks like spatially. What I was trying to think of as a way to indicate how important direct democracy is. And the best way I can think of as an economist is to just think about dollars. And so what I did here is I just collected how much money. I took California because California is a big initiative state, and I collected how much money was spent on initiatives, on ballot proposition campaigns, compared to how much money was spent on campaigns for state legislators. So the assembly, so for example, the bottom left number there shows that during the 2015-2016 electoral cycle, $471 million was spent on initiative campaigns, ballot proposition campaigns. If you compare that, the amount was spent up for the assembly is what California calls the lower house. It was $117 million for the state senate. That was $63 million for the. I'm just trying to give you an impression. If any of you have lived in states which use a lot of direct democracy, you'll already have sensed this. But when this stuff is available, it becomes a very important part of the government structure. It's not a sideshow. It doesn't replace the representative government, but it becomes very important for making big public decisions. And this kind of gives you an indication of that. If you look at the proposition numbers, they're bigger than the Assembly, they're bigger than the Senate. If you take them every year, in fact, they're bigger than them combined.
How much of this is a U.S. and maybe Switzerland phenomenon? Because we know that Switzerland has many of these things, but if I think about any other country, I find hard pressed to see it.
So I should have put this other. So I have another figure. So this happens all over the world, in fact, with increasing frequency. But it's certainly, so this is exactly right. So Switzerland was really the place that really did this most, and they were the ones that got started with it. The U.S. does a lot at the sub-national level. We see a lot of national referendums that are used periodically, Brexit and so forth. In fact, some political scientists once wrote that there were only 3 countries in the world that had not held a national referendum in the last 200 years. I haven't fact-checked this, but essentially 100 and some odd countries there are in the world. Only 3 have never done it. One of them being actually the United States. But we're seeing movements that we're seeing, for example, Germany has been expanding. Germany has been expanding use of direct democracy at the local level. Just in the last few years, several of their states have given initiative rights to all the cities within the country. So those of you who research this has created all kinds of great research opportunities, changes in regimes and stuff like that. Spain recently has added to the local level. We see these used. Japan periodically uses these acknowledged as a referendum. Taiwan adopted a national initiative law in the early 2000s, which is associated with the governing party's desire to sort of set for a formal separation from China. And then so they had some national votes. So China, Korea uses them sometimes. South America, Uruguay is the biggest user. They have quite a few. So it's being used in many places. But I think Luigi's point is right. It's not as common in most other places as it is, particularly in the U.S. and Switzerland. But I think people dabble with it, at least dabble with it in all regions of the world. And Italy, of course, has sort of a referendum law where they can appeal things. When I think they've had, about 80 or so measures in the history of the country. Sorry, there was a question.
I was wondering if you knew what caused the 2005, 2006 spike.
No, not off the top of my head. It depends on what the issue is. If I recall correctly, there might have been. So what can really drive up the numbers is if there's an industry thing, or if there's some. Nowadays, it's turning out there's a rich donor. I think that might have been the one. There's a guy named Stephen Bain who I can't remember how he got it. He's somehow involved in production of Hollywood things and stuff like that. But anyway, there was a measure that had to do with taxing some sort of energy thing, and he poured something like almost $100 million of his own money into it. He got really into this thing. So sometimes somebody just gets very passionate and starts to put a lot of money in it, and they can make the numbers look big. Okay, so I don't want to make too much of it, other than to give you a sense that this is not in the places where they use this quickly becomes a very important part of the government. Okay, so let me make sure I don't. Okay, let me switch over to populism, because I want to just lay down some basic facts. Obviously, the next couple of days, we're going to be talking a lot more about direct democracy, and I want to go in and I want to drill into, what are some of the concerns people have about direct democracy, and what's the evidence about those concerns, how serious are they, and what are some of the possible benefits of direct democracy, how might it help deal with things, and what do we know about the ability to have it. But leading into that, I want to really start here with populism. I want to say a little bit about populism. And it's a very natural transition because at root, I mean, populism is a lot of stuff, okay? And I'm a little nervous trying to say much about populism in 1 hour because obviously it's a big thing, and this I'm going to make some kind of sweeping comments, but you really can't do it justice in that much time. So that's sort of a disclaimer to what I'm going to say here. But what I'm going to try to do is suggest what I think are at least one important thing that's going on within populism, and give you at least some pieces of evidence and some facts. Hopefully, some of them you haven't seen before that'll give you some things that they know. But what's the connection between direct democracy and populism? Well, populism at root seems to be driven by a feeling that the people have that their government is outside their control. So it's a desire to try to reestablish control over their government. The feeling that it's been captured in some way by special interests or by some narrow group. And it ties very nicely to direct democracy, because direct democracy is really about people directly making decisions. So it's very natural for these things to get coupled in discussions. So let me talk a little bit about populism. The first thing is, this point I just made, is this feeling that people have that their government, that they're losing control of their government in some way. In the United States, that's certainly true. And let me give you, there's many surveys that could help you understand this, but here's one that I like. So the University of Michigan runs something called the American National Election Studies. They've been running this since 1948, I guess. And there's one question, what I like about this, there's one question, they've asked the same question since 1952. And the question is this: they said, I'm going to make a claim. Tell me if you agree or disagree with this claim. And the claim is, people like me, people like you, the respondent, people like me have no say in government. Do you agree or disagree with that? Okay. And what I did is I plotted there the percentage of people that disagree with that statement. And I'm sorry about the double negatives here, but this is the way they ask the question. Okay, so people like me have no say in government. So if you look back at 1952, you can see that of the educated people who have college degrees or better, that's the red line. You see, if you say people like me have no say in government, you'll get about 90% of the people saying, no, I disagree with that. Therefore, most people are saying, yeah, people like me do have a say in government. You get very similar numbers if you look at the people out of high school, unless you get about 70% of the people in 1952 said, no, I disagree with that. But you can see, what I presented there is smooth lines. You can see the gray is the actual data, but it's not, the smoothing isn't concealing much. There's a very pronounced downward trend here. But flash forward to 2016, where we are now. If you ask these high school or less educated people like me have no say in government. You disagree with that. Only about 30% of the people are now disagreeing with that statement. And it's very similar if you ask the people with college education. You're only getting about 30, just shy of 40% are disagreeing with that statement now. So we've seen an immense shift. This isn't a few percentage. This is a gigantic shift, and it's been going on for quite some time. People are feeling that the government, they don't have a say in government. So I like this picture, but you could ask, there's other types of questions that you could look at, but this pattern here is fairly general. Okay, so what are we to make of that? Well, first thing is that this has been going on a long time. The politicians, the political system is designed to pick up on things that worry people, and so I think it's really interesting to look at what the politicians say, so I put this up here. I didn't really want to put Trump up here, but now I think it's sort of an iron law of presentations that if you're going to do a talk on politics, you have to have Trump's picture somewhere. So I had to, but I don't want to make this about Trump, because I think Trump is an important part of what's going on, but it's bigger. It's bigger than that. But I think what's really remarkable about the last election cycle in this country is that you had essentially two outsiders come into the main parties, and in one case capture the party, and in one case come very close. Bernie Sanders, of course, is not a Democrat. He joined the Democrat. He's a socialist independent. He joined the Democratic Party to seek the nomination. He left the Democratic Party. He's not a Democrat anymore. He left after the election. But again, he came very close to capturing the nomination, or at least he put a very established nominee right up against the wall. And of course, Trump, he got the Republican nomination. But again, it's not clear that he was a Republican until fairly recently, and certainly he's not somebody that any of the Republican establishment wanted either. But if you look at what they talk about, if you look at what they articulate, they obviously they're very different, but there's a common theme to the type of things that they're saying. And so I picked from one of Sanders' speeches here, this statement there. I bolded what I think is the interesting thing when he talks about how he views his movement in a historical perspective, is that he says what he's trying to do is create a government that represents all the people and not just a few. And if you look at Trump, Trump's talking about he wants to give the government back to the people, and he's talking about the majority of Americans that are being ignored by all the elites. So I don't want to drive everybody in this room crazy by suggesting these candidates are the same, because that's going to guarantee to make everybody quite unhappy. But I do want to suggest that part of their appeal is tapping into this sort of frustration that's out there in the population about the feeling that the government has gotten out of control. Now, who they think has gotten the big difference is who they think has gotten control. Okay, so the Sanders, this is thinks it's the 1% guys that got in control. Trump is not clear; it's a little more specific different on that. But the feeling of loss of control is part of what's going on there. Yes.
So executive orders really go in the other extreme. They're like beyond representative democracy because they don't even take into account representative democracy.
Yes, so let me hold off on that because I'm going to talk. So this is going to get to the question of sort of why are people feeling this? So let me hold on because I'm going to talk about executive orders and more broadly the administrative state. Yes. Okay. So one reason I put this up here is because it's topical, but I also want to suggest that what we're seeing here is something that has deeper roots than just in 2016. One reaction to the populist movement of the last few years, one reaction is, well, the people are having a temper tantrum. There's a bunch of people who have become losers in the current economic environment, and they're trying to roll back the clock to some day that they imagined in the past, and they're resisting globalization, they're resisting technology. They just want to turn back the clock, and the best thing we should do is just kind of wait them out, kind of crush them until they go away, and then we'll move on. What I want to suggest is that's probably not the right way to think about it. It seems like there may be a temper tantrum aspect to it, but I want to suggest that there's something deeper going on, that it's not just a temper tantrum. And part of that is suggested by this long decline that I showed you in the previous picture of opinion. It's not something that just started happening recently. There's been something going on for a long time that is making people feel the way they do. And so what I want to try to do in the remaining time here today is to try to suggest that the people are, to some extent, losing control. And this is going to get to the executive orders and so forth, that the machinery of government is becoming more and more disconnected from the regular democratic processes. And so I don't think that people, regular people don't necessarily articulate and reason through it as we're going to do here, but I think they feel it in some way, and that's what we'll pick up. Which comment makes me realize I want to apologize here. This is going to be a very U.S. focused talk here, but I think what is happening is more than the U.S. I actually had an original version of this. I had a picture of Nigel Farage on there too, because he has a quote which is actually very similar to this. Which this is the Brexit guy, which was talking about getting the control of the government back. But I realized I thought that I was going to run out of time if I started to put a lot of European examples, so I'm just focusing in here. But I think a lot of there's some U.S. specific stuff here, but a lot of what's happening, I think, is going to be common to a number of advanced democracies for reasons that we think will become common. Okay, so I want to suggest now, I want to put up some facts and pieces of evidence that might suggest that, in fact, there is a loss of control happening. And so the simplest thing, let's see. It's actually surprisingly difficult to tell. It's actually surprisingly difficult to actually quantify whether people are getting the policies they want. There's a lot of opinion survey that would go ask people like, what do you think of Obamacare? Or what do you think of the Republicans' attempt to repeal it? Do you like that or not? But those don't really tell us whether people are getting, those don't really tell us whether people are getting the policies they want. We're not really asking them what would you like to have happen. And so this actually turns out to be a very prickly problem in political science to actually measure whether people are getting the policies they want. And I'm going to show you just a little bit of evidence here. Again, in the spirit, we can't prove things here, but I'll show you a little bit of evidence of some work that I've done and some other people have done in the States. So let me show you some numbers here. So I did one study a couple of years ago which identified a set of policies for which we can actually directly measure public opinion in each state. And the policies have a nice form that they're on or off policies. And so it's like death penalty. Okay, so that's a policy. Your state can either allow death penalty or not allow death penalty. So there's kind of only two outcomes there, and it's very easy to tell what's the majority preference on that policy. So I identified a set of policies like death penalty, parental notification on abortion, inheritance tax, term limits, anyway, a bunch of policies. And I was able to collect data on what did the citizens in all 50 of the states individually, what did people in Alaska think, what did people in Illinois think, what policies would they prefer. And I was able to simply compare that to policies that actually are in place in those states. And so we're able to tell for every state, either the majority is getting the policy they want or they're not getting the policy they want. So overall, 10 policies, 50 states, there's 500 observations here. Oops. Overall, the congruence was 59%. And again, here we're just tracking how close the policies to what people want. So 59%. So at first glance, you might say, well, that's not so bad. Or maybe that's good. But here's the tricky thing about that. If you were to go into each state and choose the policy by flipping a coin, okay, so I'm going to walk into Illinois and decide whether it's death penalty or not, flip a coin. You're going to get what the majority wants 50% of the time, just by luck. So in some sense, we're getting 9% better than we get if we chose policies by flipping a coin. This isn't, I just put this to make the slide not look so boring, but you can see the congruence rate of each of your states if you want to squint there. So I think Illinois' congruence rate is about 70%. Some other political scientists, a very big political scientist at Columbia did a very similar study. Lax and Phillips did a very similar study looking at 39 policies over 50 states, so it's much bigger than I was able to look at. And they calculated exactly the same thing. How often are the policies congruent with what the majority wants? They got 49%, which is essentially flipping a coin. And they called that the democratic deficit. Yes?
So how much is caused basically is it's inefficient how lawmakers work, and how much is caused by, for example, the redistricting, where you basically see majority, like Democrats being kind of left out.
Okay, so this is an awesome question, which is why it's happening. And so let me go forward in there. I think this is a very active area of research. With these, there's other types of facts out here. Again, I'm just giving you a couple of bold examples. But this is a very active question. So why is this happening? Because I think that people who look at the data have become increasingly convinced that there's something to this idea that representation is not working so well. So let me go forward and try to give you some because I have some things on that. Having said that, the answer isn't completely. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do, and I think that question was a good lead-in. In the background, we have some notion of what direct democracy is about, is that we've got some people over here who want some certain policies, and then there's some policies, and there should be some influence or connection going on there. That's the basic idea of democracy. The way we do it in practice is the people, except when we do direct democracy, the peoples are being channeled through a bunch of institutions, legislature, executive, and courts. And so if things aren't working quite right, if the policy's not, if people's views aren't being connected into policy, it must be that there's something going on. There's something going on in one or more of those pieces. And so what I want to do just for a couple minutes talk about each of those pieces and tell you what we know about those. Yes.
Do you know if there's been work that differentiates between proportional and representative democracies, if there's a difference?
There's been a ton of work on that. There's some people that argue that one's better than the other. I'm not convinced by much of the evidence. But I don't think it's a closed case. Okay, so again, I'm focusing here specifically on the U.S. But the question is, if the people's preferences are somehow not registering in policy, it must be because there's a breakdown going on in there. So let me tell you what I think is most likely to be happening. The biggest problem is really centered. Well, I don't know if it's a problem, but the biggest cause of this, I think, is probably centered on the executive. And let me give you an example. It really has to do with what's called the rise of the administrative state, which is a term that a lot of professors and public administration scholars have used. I took this quote from Justice Samuel Alito. He gave a talk a couple months ago, and he made that comment right there. I'll give you a chance to read it. So what does he mean by this? And again, this isn't just sort of something that he sort of made up. This is something that a number of people have been talking about. The basic premise of the democratic system is that we're supposed to elect these officials, and the Congress in particular at the federal level in the U.S. is the one that's supposed to make the laws, and then the administration sort of implements them. But we've actually moved into a world where most of the laws are now being made by the administrative branch. And first of all, to give you a scale of that, I just picked some little facts there. The U.S., it's not clear exactly how many agencies there are now. It depends exactly how you define them, but there's somewhere between 60 and 160 agencies within the executive branch. There's more than 1 million workers working in these agencies, and that's not counting the Department of Defense, so it's not counting people in the armed services, it's not counting the Postal Service, so this is just the bureaucracy, if you will. And they're very, very busy.
2 million workers in the agencies.
Yeah. And they're very busy at issuing rules. Now, the interesting thing is their rules have the force of law, and I'll say a little more about this in just a minute, but they issue lots of rules. In 2016, they added 97,000 pages to the Federal Register, which was comprised of 3,852 final rules. And now these rules have the force of law. So it's 3,852 rules, 2,300 proposed rules, plus executive orders and memorandums, plus agencies also give advisory letters. You can go to the SEC and ask them, can you tell me if I'd be a violation of the law if I do things? And they issue an advisory thing, which you probably almost surely want to follow, even though it doesn't have the force of law, so they're issuing advisory letters as well. So there's a lot of stuff. Okay, why is this happening? Well, it's because, here's a simple example. Let me take the Environmental Protection Agency. It's because Congress has turned over this power to these agencies. And the way it works is, and I took, so the EPA, of course, is Environmental Protection Agency. They regulate the water, the air, all sorts of things having to do with the environment. And they have their powers through a whole bunch of acts. For example, the Safe Water Drinking Act gives the EPA the power to regulate, to make the water safe to drink. That's all a very good thing. But the way Congress essentially does it, and I put a quote there from the actual act, is the way Congress does these things now is Congress says, we hereby declare that the water must be safe to drink. And you, EPA, figure out how to make that happen. So you can see there, the administrator, that's the EPA administrator, shall publish a maximum contaminant level and then promulgate a national primary drinking regulations. Okay, and now the scope of this is potentially enormous, right? This could be rules about what kind of filters are in water fountains in elementary schools, to waste treatment plants in cities. This could cover a whole bunch of different things. It's very open-ended, and the Congress didn't go in there and fill in the details. Well, there are a lot of details in the law. I don't mean to suggest that, but they've given a lot of scope for the folks within these agencies to make decisions. Let me give you another example. Trade policy. The U.S. Constitution is very clear who decides trade. The Congress. This is Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, impose excises, and regulate commerce with foreign nations. So it's very clear that Congress has that power. Well, starting in 1930, Congress started to turn that power over to the President with the Tariff Act of 1930, and there's been a whole bunch of things after that. And you can see what they basically said. They said, look, the President, you know what, if it's in the public interest, the President actually can proclaim and declare new or additional duties. And subsequent acts of Congress also gave the President the power to impose quotas, to take tariffs off, to put them on. So that's another example. Let me give you one more, which I think is just a fun one, because I learned something as doing the research of this. The Congress has the power to declare national parks. So a national park means this area of land is now off limits, it's preserved. Well, starting in, I think it was 1906, the Congress turned that power over to the executive branch as well. They said, you know what, you can declare national parks too, but you can't call them national parks. They're called national monuments. So if you ever wonder what the difference between a national park and a national monument is, the national monuments are created by presidential orders. So the first one over there is Devil's something or other in Wyoming, I forget which one it is. But the water one is a Devil's Tower. Somebody from Wyoming sort of knows it. The one on the right is one of the newest ones, and it's to me the sort of breathtaking power that's been turned over to the President actually. So this is a marine preserve in the northwest part of Hawaii, and it's a string of islands. It was originally set off. It was originally declared a national monument by President George W. Bush, and then President Obama added onto it as well. It's now more than, it's 580,000 square miles. have been preserved. That is larger than Germany. And it was done not by Congress. It was done by 2 presidents signing it on. Okay, so one of the outgrowths of this has been what's sometimes called technocracy. A lot of the decision is being made by experts within agencies. Now, why is this happening? The reason it's happening, some people are very mad at Congress for doing this. They're saying that they're sort of shirking their responsibility. I think Alito might have a little bit of a feeling of that his speech went off in that direction. And there may be an element of that Congress is shirking. They don't want to take the heat for things. But I think there's a more fundamental reason that this is happening, and that is that as governments become bigger, and as the world becomes more complex, it's well beyond the expertise of the Congress to be able to micromanage all the details of these things. So it makes a lot of sense for them to declare basic goals, basic parameters, and then turn it over to experts. It's almost incomprehensible that we could run our government any other way. And this is not just true for the federal government in the U.S., it's true for the states, and it's true for European countries. The world's just becoming more complicated, and you need experts to make decisions. But the problem, of course, is these experts who are now making decisions are not elected. They're very kind of indirectly connected to the executive branch. Okay, but you still might say, well, but we do elect the president, so that should give us democratic control. The president controls these technocrats within all these agencies. It should still work okay, again, because we elect the president. So why does that not quite work? Well, first of all, a lot of the agencies are set up to be independent of the president. I listed some of the best-known ones there. They're not technically independent because they can't be independent according to the Constitution, but they're set up independent. The president appoints the person that runs them, and in most situations can remove those people. But it's not that the president has daily oversight with these agencies. So there's been structural things to make them independent. On top of that, think about direct reports. I put direct reports up there. So those of you who think about corporations, there's this literature that tries to understand what's the optimal number of direct reports for a CEO to have. Okay, and the number they usually come up with is sort of less than 10. Something less than 10 would be the right number for direct reports. How many direct reports does the president have? Well, it's not really clear. It depends how you count, but it's got to be, by my count, it's somewhere in the range of 43 to 157, not counting the independent. So if you think a CEO is going to be overloaded and not be able to keep track of things with more than 10, figure it out here. So that's yet another reason. Even though we can elect the president, how much ability does the president have to really even keep track of these things is not clear. The other problem that pops up with this is what's been called regulatory capture. Once you set up a system where the laws are being made primarily by these technical experts within the bureaucracies, you've created a system that the only people that can really talk to them are people that can afford lawyers and understand all the detailed ways that the rulemaking process works within the federal bureaucracy. And that really boils down to very large organized industry groups or companies or highly organized interest groups like a very wealthy environmental group or something. Somebody that's heavily lawyered up and really understands the details of the bureaucratic process. So you created a situation where, again, not only is it decoupled from the democratic process, but you've also sort of advantaged a particular type of folks as well. Okay, so that's a too brief run through of what is perhaps causing a disconnect in the federal agencies, and I think that's probably the main thing that's causing there to be this disconnect. The bureaucracies run on their own to some extent, and there is some popular control, but it's very weak. It's very weak in Europe. Okay, let me say a little bit because it's more than that. It's also the courts. The courts have become increasingly important in actually making law. The courts were originally set up to try to adjudicate when there's sort of somebody passed a law and it's not really clear what it means. Somebody has to come in and clean up. The courts were supposed to do that. And I'm trying to think of a way to quantify the importance of courts for you. And I don't have a great one. I think people who observe courts are well aware of this, but I just put two, which are more for fun than for anything else. First of all, come on, go here. What I did here is I plotted the number of Supreme Court decisions that reverse Congress. Okay, this is just to give you a sense of this. And you can see that the courts have become increasingly active in reversing Congress. And again, Congress is probably designed to be the most democratic part of the system. It's the most electorally connected one. And the other thing that I thought would be interesting, because I've been particularly struck by this, is another way to gauge how important the courts have been is just how much people talk about it and care about who's on the court. So I did another thing. Do you guys know this thing, Google Ngram? Google Ngram, you know? So some of you do that. Okay, good. Okay, so Google has all these documents in the English language digitized, all these books, all these journals, and you can type in code, you can type in words and have it talk about and have it report out how many times that word has been mentioned in the English language. So I typed in Supreme Court nominee or Supreme Court nomination. Let's see how much people were talking about this issue. And I plotted it from essentially 1800 to the present, and there's the numbers. And what you can see is that basically nobody cared who was nominated to the Supreme Court for most of the country's history. It only was, sometime in the 60s that they started to care a little bit, and then there's been a dramatic ballooning of increased interest in who's nominated to the Supreme Court starting in the 1990s. And I'm pointing that out, I mean, people that are sort of getting on the older end of the spectrum, like me, this is surprising, but for some of you who haven't been paying attention that long, and you've seen all the tremendous activity about the recent court nominees, you might think that that's the way it's always been. But it's not. It's actually very new. Nobody used to care who the Supreme Court nominees were. I mean, obviously the people who got nominated cared to some extent. Congress didn't do hearings until about the 1920s. That wasn't something. Often they would people would be nominated one day in the morning, the president would send a nomination over and they'd vote to approve it in the afternoon. It wasn't a particularly desirable job. People would quit to do other things. Even as recently as the 1960s, one Supreme Court justice stepped down so he could take the United Nations ambassador job. It would be unheard of now. But it wasn't that important. It's become increasingly important because the courts are now really sort of making law. And so there's another thing that's going on here. I don't know what the term is. There's actually a Greek word that I didn't understand it. I suspect you guys didn't either. But it's like the judgeocracy is one of the concerns that's coming on here. What's the problem? Federal judges are not elected and they have lifetime appointments. So they're immunized by design away from the democratic process. There's also been an increasing movement toward specialization amongst judges. Nowadays, it's very normal for a Supreme Court nominee to have served as a judge on an appellate court. In fact, if it's not the case, people would wonder nowadays. But that's a very new development. And most of the time, the judges they weren't professional judges. They were politicians, a former senator, solicitor general, former president. They were essentially friends of the president, and it wasn't that big a deal. But we moved to a highly technocratic mode in the judicial system as well. Now, it's beyond the scope really to talk about why this is happening in this talk, but it is happening. I'll just tell you what I think is the main cause without being able to go into it. Maybe if there's time afterwards, I'm happy to say a little bit more. But I think the root cause is that it's become very difficult to amend the basic laws of the country. There's been only 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution since the country was set up, and hardly any substance for the last 50 years. Compare that to states. All states have constitutions. They amend them all the time. It's not uncommon if states have 100 or more amendments and they rewrite their constitution from scratch periodically as well. The U.S. Constitution has become very difficult to amend. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that the Constitution was written in 1787. And so increasingly cases are coming to the judges that are presenting questions which are very hard to answer by looking into the text of the document. There's things that are being referred to or things that are important that simply aren't written or weren't envisioned in the document. And so what happens, judges are in the position where they have to either completely punt on the issue, which could be bad, or they have to somehow figure out some sort of interpretation out of the document that isn't plainly there in the text. And that leads to a lot of controversies about how these things get interpreted and so forth. So I don't have time to go into that, but I think that's part of what's going on there. I skipped the legislature, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the legislature very much, although there's some research trying to measure the connection between the legislature. So is there a breakdown between the people and the legislature? I'll just mention one study that I did recently. This is a Stigler Center working paper, if you're interested. But I was able to get actual roll call votes, 3,500 roll call votes, where I was able to tell how the state legislators were voting on particular laws, and I was able to get very precise information on what their constituents wanted them to do on each of these laws. And I wanted to see how often were they voting congruent with the majority opinion in their district. And the number I got out of that was 65%. Again, it's 50% is probably the flipping coin based one, so it's better than flipping a coin. It's not so bad compared to some of those other numbers, but it's not really awesome either. So there's some reason to believe that legislators aren't so well. So I wanted to say something about Europe, but I know we don't have time here, but I do want to point out that a lot of the root causes that are acting in the United States, the rise of sort of technical decision makers in bureaucracies or in cards are common to all sort of developing developed advanced economies. There's a need to rely more and more on experts. And so that's just something that's happening all over the globe. There's Europe-specific things as well that have to do with the European Union exercise, which is including a higher level of decision makers in there. So there's Europe-specific things, but some of the underlying things are related. Why now? So this stuff has been building up for a long time. Why now? Is this coming to the fore? Well, there's multiple reasons, but I think the simplest reason is fairly clear. It was the financial crisis, the recession. I think that, as you can see from the public opinion, there's been a bit of a festering out there about the government. People feel they're losing control of the government. During the financial crisis, people observed a lot of government effort to aid big banks, insurance companies, car companies, and so forth. Again, there may have been good reasons for that or not, but the optics of it look like these wealthy groups got taken care of quite well, whereas nobody particularly cared about people whose jobs were sort of leaking away due to automation or globalization and so forth. And it seems like this was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back during that. We sort of brought all these things to the surface. Okay, so let me stop there so I can leave a few minutes for questions. But what I'm trying to suggest here, in a nutshell, is that the feeling that people are losing control of their government is something that has been growing over time. It's not something that just happened in the last year or two. And it looks like there's something to it. It's not fabricated out of air. It's not an irrational tantrum. But gradually some of our institutions are being decoupled from popular control. And then what I want to talk about the next couple classes is, well, how can we use direct democracy to maybe deal with that? And of course, the real problem is we don't want to take away the specialists. We need the specialists. We need them, but how can we sort of inject some popular control? Yes.
Yeah, so I have two questions. When we have direct democracy, unlike a legislature debating various policies, compromise and trading is difficult. So I'm wondering sort of what are the implications that when you have single vote issues, you can't sort of trade off what you're willing to do for someone else versus what he's willing to do for you, whether that's good or bad. And then secondly, I just don't recall, did you show us the chart as to what the trend is in direct democracy initiatives? I know you showed.
No, I have one. I can.
Okay. You can
I'll do it tomorrow.
All right.
But the trend is up. But it has volatility to it. As far as the general appointment, so there's a lot of reasons people have been concerned about direct democracy for a long time. It's not sort of a magic wand that we should just say let's do it and there's no problem, because there's a reason we have representatives and they can compromise. They can focus more on issues. There's a whole bunch of good reasons to have representatives. So partly this comes down to trade-offs, but this issue of being able to compromise and to make deals is a big one. I think it ultimately comes down to kind of looking at the output. What will often happen in, say, initiative campaigns is that if somebody's, say, getting ready to sponsor a law, they might talk to other groups and have sort of a negotiation before they write something up to try to see what, if we do it like this, will you come on board, will you help fund the campaign? So there's sort of a discussion that goes. But whether that works or not is, I really think, an empirical question, depends on the output. I'm going to try to suggest that it works reasonably well. No form of democracy is ever perfect, but I'm going to suggest that it's actually reasonably good. Yeah.
So examples of direct democracy that you offered were mostly on the margin. These are isolated issues that maybe we can understand. In your research, you're able to isolate perhaps 10 issues for it to be a polling on individuals. Another paper brings up to 39. Is it actually possible to expand the set of issues that direct democracy can deal with? How would someone propose a budget for direct democracy? And who would receive the CIA briefings on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I think you're raising, so these are really good issues about the ability. So certainly for confidential matters, we almost surely need experts. It's hard to see how we would want to do that. I mean, budgets, there's a lot of ways you can do budgets. That's a very popular topic for direct democracy. You can require voter approval for debt issues or tax increases or spending increases, as I said. People very often write laws and they propose spending for certain programs or shutting down certain programs. So there's ways you can't do it. You can't do the annual budget year after year by direct democracy. That's not going to work. But you can set policy.
It's too long to read. No individual is going to read the entire budget.
No individual is going to read the entire budget exactly right, including the legislators. Okay. That's the important. And I'll talk about that next time. That's what nobody reads the.
If they divide it up and they have some understanding of what's in each section.
So understanding is exactly right. So understanding is going to be the key issue. I'll talk about that next time. But understanding does not mean reading. It turns out, and we'll see that. The classic example is so people say, well, if we had a vote on suppose we had a vote on Obamacare. So I'm pie in the sky here. Well, one of the concerns is well nobody could have read it. It was too long. Well, the trick is that nobody who actually voted on it, the congressman, read it either, nor did the president. Okay, that's not the way it works. But I'll talk more about this because this is a really central point about how do people make decisions in these public spheres and are they competent to make decisions. It's an absolutely essential issue.
I was really confused, or at least when I saw the title, I thought it really provocative in the sense that I would see those two as opposites almost, in the sense that populism, when we talk about do people want to pay less taxes, everybody would say yes, without basically looking through to like other the deeper meaning. So that's, I'm really sure, I'm curious how you respond to that. The second one is, especially when we're looking to Europe, even though I know it was mostly US focused, but what we see happening is whenever we have bigger issues, they basically use the referendums to basically to say that they're dissatisfied with what the politicians are doing and therefore voting against everything that's in front of them. So whenever, I think it was in Italy as well, with Renzi, when he said, okay, this reforms need to go through, otherwise I will quit, people start voting against, well, both because they didn't like the measure, but also because they didn't like the politician. So how does that resolve that?
Again, it's a good point. So sometimes people say, well, direct democracy, that won't work because people will just cut their taxes all the time and will go off a cliff. But that's an empirical question. Is that actually what happens? It's not, actually. And so I'll be digging a lot into that next time. So I'm hearing a lot of, these are really good questions because these are the questions that people say, well, direct democracy has this problem, this problem, this problem. And they're all actually things that have to be taken very seriously. But next time especially I'm going to be focused on sort of criticisms, and I'm going to go through the evidence. And I think the evidence is pretty convincing that most of the problems that people worry about are much less than they say. So this thing about they all cut taxes, they don't. They're actually very responsible.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the last point you made, that the crisis, the Great Recession, sort of has brought this to a head now. I guess I just feel since Obama was reelected in 2012, 4 years after the crisis, that's that sort of a sentiment that says we were happy, people were happy, or I know that Congress looked a lot different after that election, but I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more, why you think that's happening.
So, okay, yeah. So I don't want to make that. So going back to something I said at the beginning, which is trying to immunize myself from this a little bit, there's obviously multiple things that go on. So just saying there's one thing that happened is going to be incomplete. I'm looking for something. I'm looking for something that can explain why we have this trend, but we have this sort of spike up really in the current election. I think so many things point to the folks that are really associated with the populist movement are people that were particularly hard hit by the Great Recession, and those are typically the people we think of as relatively less skilled. They're manual workers, they're not brain workers, if you will, and they're also skills that are automatable in some sense. And if you look at the macro evidence, this is a bit of a plug for my colleague Nir Haimovich's work, a macroeconomist, but he looks at sort of how wages responded amongst three groups of the population. And if you look at brain workers, which is presumably us, people like us, there was a hit when the Great Recession came down, and then it went back up. And if you look at manual laborers who do non-routinizable jobs, like janitors is a classic example, their wages got hit and it went back up. If you look at that group in the middle there, which is manual workers who do routinizable jobs, their wages went down and are just flat. They haven't come back at all. And those people fit into, to some extent, some of the groups that are often mentioned as being the Trump supporters. So I don't think we can establish a tight line of causality in terms of what we'd like to do in an academic, if it was a really scholarly exercise, but I think that it circumstantially, it's the guys who were hit particularly hard and who fueled this movement. The movement was fueled by the people who were hit particularly hard, so it looks like they got activated. But I don't mean to. I don't want to. That particular point, I don't want to push too far. But I think if you're looking for something that happened fairly recently, that's more. Yes.
You mentioned Brexit. So to me, that's a pretty clear example of why referendums don't work, because it's such a complicated issue and you make a very simple question and then now they have to put it into practice and nobody really knows what that means. So I wonder.
So yeah, I want to say more about Brexit, because I think one of the thing that I've heard the most about Brexit is that the people that don't like the outcome, the most common concern is the people who voted no, that is, people who wanted to exit, didn't understand what they were doing. So there's a common concern that sort of, can voters really grasp these sort of issues? So I guess I want to punt a little bit on that, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how voters decide. I don't know what the best evidence is that the voters who said exit didn't understand what they were doing.
I mean, nobody knows now what that will mean. So there's plenty of different ways of exiting, and that the vote didn't clarify that. So.
Yeah, and so I guess I think of that as similar to what Congress does when it passes the Clean Water Act. They don't know exactly how it's going to be implemented, nor is that their function to work out all the details. They say, but I want you guys to set standards to make sure the school kids don't have to drink bad water. Figure out the details. So I guess I'd be inclined to think Brexit is of that form. It says we want to get away from, we don't want to be part of this European exercise and have sort of some of our sovereignty taken away. You figure it out. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing is a totally different issue. Okay, but that's the way I think about it. It's a normal legislative process. People don't really get into the really micro details.
There has been this huge popularism movement in Hong Kong in the past few years. So some people are saying we should let people directly vote and for their chief executive, as opposed to only vote for those candidates pre-approved by Beijing. So I'm just wondering, has there been precedents before or comparable cases where the voters directly vote for their chief leader? And my second question is, do you think that will be the answer for the situations like Hong Kong, or is there a middle solution?
So I guess I think the Hong Kong situation is worse in some senses. That it's not about getting more direct democracy, it's about getting democracy. Because with the candidates, for the city administration being chosen by Beijing, the people don't have choices over their representatives. So I think that is actually making, it's unfortunately, it's not even a representative democracy in some respects now. So I don't think, again, direct democracy is really voting on the laws. I think what you're talking about is, I just want to vote on, I just want to be able to choose my candidate. Yeah.
Question about the chart you showed with decreasing agreement with whether or not I have influence over the government. I'm just wondering what you think the drivers of that might be. The factors that just came to mind very quickly were, one, population was growing, wealth and incomes were growing, wealth and income disparities were growing, and maybe you could make the case that capture or elements of capture were growing as well. But
it's a big country. These are all very complicated. There's a bunch of things that are going on. I guess the part I was trying to suggest is important is that, in fact, the government is becoming detached from people. And I don't think ordinary people see the big picture, but they're a coal miner and they notice that somebody they don't quite understand made some regulation on what sort of has to be done with a little creek in their area, and to them, they go, man, I don't understand the issue because I know this creek and this isn't a problem in their mind, and it feels to them like some bureaucrats, and they don't even know how that happened. And so I think these little things sort of accumulate over time in people's mind that they sort of feel like things are getting out of control. That's obviously at most a partial explanation. I know we don't push it too far, but that's what I think is part of what's going on. Yes.
Does this kind of strict two-party system in the states exacerbate this problem by limiting options in terms of like the farther extreme political groups?
Well, there's a big problem with politics is that as a government, it's more and more complicated. When you're voting for somebody, you're voting for if you want a mathematical term, you're voting for a vector, right? You're voting for somebody that has a whole bunch of different positions. And people have all kinds of rich preferences over all those things, and you get two choices. Okay, so you're never going to get somebody who's right on all dimensions for you. That's just not going to happen. And so the fact that the dimensionality of the choice that is small is a problem when you have a complicated government. If there's only one issue to be decided, two is enough. If there's 10,000 issues, we have hardly any choices. So the people we're going to choose are not going to represent us very, very, very directly. So I think that's a problem. I don't know that, it's hard to know what's a better way to do it, but I think that's part of the problem. I mean, switch back to this side, there was a hand over there.
Going back to the graph that you showed about how people view the judiciary or the judicial system, I'm not sure what you were trying to infer from that, but it's just a comment. I would be cautious from reading too much into that, because the spike from, I think it started from the 1980s, could actually be a function of the fact that the appointment process for the judiciary started to become televised, especially the hearings in the Senate. So it could be that because these things became televised, the people began to know about the importance of the role that the ideological judge plays in before the Supreme Court rather than the other way.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and so I wouldn't make too much out of that either. I'm trying to be a little bit provocative here, but I do think the general point that the courts are becoming increasingly important in sort of the lawmaking function, I think that will hold up to a bunch of things. I think they're having to fill in blank spaces in the Constitution. Just to be somewhat controversial here, but it's concrete. But certainly one of the most controversial decisions of the last 40, 50 years was Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade was, which of course was an abortion rights decision, but Roe versus Wade was founded on the principle of a right to privacy. That's where it came from. Now the problem is the right to privacy. Those words do not exist in the Constitution. There is no right to privacy in the Constitution. So to brief that decision, there had to be some reasoning from, essentially from due process and rights to be free from unreasonable seizures of property and so forth. It had to be stretched out. But it's because something that wasn't complicated. It wasn't contemplated originally when the Constitution was written. The court felt it had to fill in something, but that had the effect of essentially making law, because there wasn't really something there. But I think that's increasingly been the case, that the courts are increasingly driving the law to
John, you can control for the guy at the head of the SEC. He's probably televised. Nobody watches.
Oh, so I could look at other ones too. Yeah, I could check it out. Yes. Yeah. So I'm not. So there's these really good. So some of these are like really good. Like if I was giving a scholarly presentation here, I'd have to control for causality. So I'm trying not to go into those things. But yes, from that one, yes, absolutely.
Is there a branch of this research that compares direct democracy to proxy access? Because a lot of the arguments against proxy access, advisory versus binding votes, are similar. In other words, shareholders are diffuse and they don't know better, and we've delegated the authority to the board and to the executive branch.
So I do a lot of work on that actually. So actually, I'm trying to push that. Yeah. So I've been trying to push those parallels. So I think the underlying economic system. Yeah. You all need to go. I don't want to keep people, but happy to chat if anyone wants to chat.
No, sorry.
Yeah. No.